Hello! And so we begin. World Cinema Masterpieces, 1960 to 1980. A cursory glance at that title and the syllabus of this course raises some questions that I want to address briefly at the start of today's lecture. First, the title. Why does the course treat films specifically between 1960 and 1980? Why those dates? Well, as an art form, cinema is only a little over a century old. But I wanted to give some historical focus to our study, and the 20-year period I've chosen provides a convenient bracket. We begin with the rise of the French New Wave, an immensely influential movement that arose in Paris in the early 1960s under the inspiration of Truffaut, Godard, and other young filmmakers, and that challenged the cinematic conventions of the time, especially those of the Hollywood studio system, which had developed during the previous 3 decades. But really challenged film conventions that had arisen since the dawn of sound film in the early 1930s. And the course then concludes with the rise of another seminal movement, the so-called New Cinema of Germany, in the mid-1970s, led by such directors as Fassbinder, Herzog, and Wim Wenders. Well, between these two European movements, the course will explore masterworks in a variety of genres and traditions, from one of the most fertile and creative and experimental 20-year epochs in world cinema history. The films under consideration are works by major directors from 10 different countries in North America, Europe, and Asia. Now, there's one other reason why I chose these particular historical parameters. Over the past decade, I've taught a course focusing on the years in cinema 1930 to 1960. That began with the rise of German Expressionism in the early 30s and ended with the French New Wave, which is where we are beginning in this course. Well, after having offered that earlier course 4 times, I wanted to investigate some of the great films that followed from and responded to those earlier works. And so I created the course that you are taking. I first taught it 2 years ago, and this is the second iteration. Now, lecturing online, I will be the first to tell you, is not ideal, and I would much rather be facing you in a Dealey Hall classroom. But offering a cinema course in this remote format has a few curious advantages. First, I can embed the scenes that I'll be analyzing within the lecture, and there will be anywhere from 8 to 12 clips from the film, any particular film, in each lecture. Second, in this format, you can stop and start the lecture whenever you like. There's no need for you to absorb 75 to 80 minutes of Sicker all at once. And you can even replay segments of the lecture if you feel that you've missed something or feel particularly inspired. Now, as I noted in my email, I do want to hear your thoughts and questions about the film. So each Friday from 4 until around 4:30 or a little later perhaps, I'll be inviting you to join me in a question-answer session. Starting not the first day of class, the 28th, but the following Friday. That will be our first session of this kind, and I want to emphasize that those sessions are entirely voluntary. Even if just a few of you participate in the conversation each week, that's fine with me. Okay. A second question that you might have at the outset about the course, if you've glanced at the syllabus, is this. What is the basis for organizing these films that we're studying? Well, in the broadest sense, I've structured the course historically, moving from the early 1960s forward through the 1970s and using the French New Wave and the New German Cinema as brackets. But the course is not strictly chronological. In all, we're going to be studying 17 films that reflect different traditions or schools of filmmaking during that 20-year span. And in addition to the French and German movements that, as I've suggested, bracket the course, we'll also consider what is sometimes called the Second Italian Film Renaissance. This includes works by Antonioni, Portocovo, and Bernardo Bertolucci, all of whom depart in significant ways from the Italian neo-realist directors of the 1950s. But there are other organizational features built into the syllabus apart from historical movements. Beyond film history, I've also organized the course with attention to genre. That is, movies which belong to familiar types or categories of narrative filmmaking, but which, not surprisingly, often revise or reinterpret those genres. Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, for example, is part of the genre we call epic cinema. Alton's McCabe and Mrs. Miller is a revisionist take on the American Western. Polanski's Chinatown both conforms to and challenges the fascinating genre of film noir with its urban setting, underworld crime and violence. And Nicholas Roeg's Walkabout, set in the Australian outback, belongs to the still thriving genre of survival movies. Other films we'll be studying contain elements of other genres, including melodrama and even documentary. Now, beyond history and genre, there's a third organizational principle that I've used to create the structure of the course, and that is style. Several films in the syllabus are arranged on the basis of their distinctive cinematic style or technique. Surrealism, in the cases of Buñuel's Exterminating Angel and Teshigahara's Woman in the Dunes, expressionism in the case of Ingmar Bergman's incomparable Cries and Whispers. Finally, when no other organizational rubrics seemed appropriate, I have simply invoked nationality. That's why Kubrick and Scorsese and Malick are arranged under the heading Three American Auteurs. I'll explain that key term auteur shortly, but I think the only real link among those three directors is the land of their birth. Okay, now the last and perhaps most obvious question that you might ask is why these particular 17 films? To put it another way, what is my criteria for the rather loaded word in the title, masterpieces? Well, primarily I've chosen the films based on their individual aesthetic merits, but I'm hardly alone in these judgments about these films. In a provocative essay that I've posted on Blackboard and strongly recommend to you, titled Canon Fodder, the filmmaker and critic Paul Schrader discusses the film canon, that is, the pantheon of films that specialists, scholars, and critics have over several decades judged to be the most essential and enduring. Now, just as we include works like King Lear and Moby Dick and Pride and Prejudice and The Wasteland as key works within the literary canon, so too, Schrader argues, certain films are indispensable, are undeniable classics. But Schrader concedes that any canon in film is likely to generate controversy. And this is specifically true of cinema studies because, after all, film is an inherently popular art form and also a radically democratic art form. Everybody goes to the movies, or at least we used to before COVID. And the exponents of popular culture have often called into question the aesthetic and political legitimacy of anything as exclusive as a so-called film canon. Thus, Schrader asks, quote, "Here is the problem. How can you have a film canon when the very existence of motion pictures as a popular culture art form has played a decisive role in the collapse or destabilization of the literary canon?" Well, Schrader answers his own question by positing 5 criteria upon which he bases his own choices and his own compilation of a pantheon of great films. It is a group that constitutes essentially Schrader's own personal canon. And these criteria that he enumerates include beauty, strangeness, by which he means a kind of disarming originality, formal unity, an awareness of cinematic tradition, and finally, an ability to hold up over time. Now, the image on the cover of his article, when you look at it, is from Jean Renoir's Rules of the Game, which Schrader considers the greatest film ever made. Personally, as much as I admire Rules of the Game, I would choose for my own greatest film Renoir's other masterpiece, Grand Illusion. But I certainly can't disagree with Schrader's criteria for judgment. Now, one could argue that his 5 categories are themselves subjective and even eccentric, but I think they're useful in thinking about what constitutes a great film. In fact, I confess that somewhat unsystematically, I've used roughly similar criteria in selecting the 17 films in this course. But I've also used 2 other bases for the selection of these so-called masterpieces. First, as noted, I've included important films that reflect major historical movements and major genres, so that they are representative of more than just themselves. And second, I've chosen films that represent the work of the greatest and most influential directors of the 20 years that we are covering. And this emphasis on directors is in itself something that betrays a particular approach in the course, and it is an approach that has long been a source of fierce debate in film studies. That approach to cinema, and the one that I am employing in the course, is called the auteur theory. The term originated in France in the 1950s, coined by the writers of the journal Cahiers du Cinéma, who became the New Wave directors. But the auteur theory was popularized and promoted in America in The Village Voice by the critic Andrew Sarris in the 1960s. Now, auteur means author, and the auteur theorists regard the film director, particularly those directors whom they regard as great, as the author-creators of the works that they direct. Now, this view is controversial because unlike novel writing or painting, film is inherently a collaborative medium involving writers and actors and technicians beyond the director. But auteur directors are those who exercise the most totalizing creative control over this process, and who are, as a result, capable of shaping the final work most completely to reflect their own personal vision and values. Sarris writes that auteur theory is really, quote, an attitude, a table of values that converts film history into directorial autobiography. The auteur theory values the personality of the director, a personality or signature that in certain cases, Sarris says, can emerge even under the strictures of Hollywood's division of labor system and its demand for conventions. Some directors can rise above that. Sarris notes not all directors are auteurs. Indeed, he would argue that most are not. And the litmus test for Sarris, for auteur directors, is twofold. First, does the director exercise an auteur's maximum control over the film, from scripting to shooting to editing, the way great auteurs, in his judgment, like Fritz Lang and Alfred Hitchcock and Jean Renoir and Orson Welles do? And the second litmus test is this: does the director create what Sarris calls, quote, a self-contained world with its own consistent themes, laws, and moral landscapes? Something that gives to each film by the particular auteur director an unmistakable stamp of his own values and personality. Well, for Sarris, a film auteur, like a great poet, is ultimately recognizable in the distinctive quality of his individual self-expression from film to film. And this personal stamp comes both through a distinctive visual style and, as suggested, through a consistency of moral or philosophical vision throughout the director's career. Now, not surprisingly, some critics in the 1960s and 70s, such as the late Pauline Kael, raged against what they regarded as the elitist pretensions and misconceptions of the auteur theory. Kael, in particular, in a famous provocation titled Trash Art in the Movies, also on Blackboard for you to read, writes, quote, "Let's clear away a few misconceptions. Movies make hash of the schoolmarm's approach to how well the artist fulfilled his intentions. Whatever the original intention of the writers and director, it is usually supplanted as the production gets underway by the intention to make money. This is especially true, of course, in Hollywood films. Therefore," Kael writes, quote, "a film should not be analyzed like a lyric poem. Films," she insists, "are meant to be enjoyed, and, quote, simply to be enjoyable, movies don't need a very high level of craftsmanship, let alone a great director." Now, how does one respond to such a militantly populist view from a renowned and much loved New Yorker critic? Well, I suppose it depends on how one defines that word enjoyable. I must tell you that the intellectual pleasures we're going to be pursuing in this course are far closer to the celebration of self-conscious filmmaking and intellectual analysis that Sarris describes in his auteur theory than to the utilitarian delights that Cale champions. So, just as I happily accept the idea of a canon of great films, I also embrace the auteurist principle that certain directors, the greatest directors, I think, are the ultimate self-expressive, independent creators of the films that they make, notwithstanding the fact that they must collaborate with others under their direction. Now, as a result, while the 17 films I've selected reflect important movements and genres and styles, they also represent 17 of the most important directors of the period that we're covering, each of whom is, I think, a distinctive auteur. Because the course is titled World Cinema Masterpieces, I've tried to be geographically inclusive, at least as much as possible. We'll consider films by directors from France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Britain, Poland, Japan, and several from the United States. But I suspect that the cinephiles among you may have already formulated a kind of private protest. Where is Director X? How could you leave off Director Y? What happened to Director Z? Well, in some cases, X, Y, and Z were covered in the earlier course from 1930 to 1960. This is true of Hitchcock, Kurosawa, Fellini, and the great Indian director Satyajit Ray. While these auteurs continued making films well into the 1960s and 70s, their most distinctive and groundbreaking work belongs, I think, to the 1950s, thus their omission from the present course. Let's turn now to the hefty syllabus that I sent you as an email attachment, and let's start with the most practical matters. Where are these films available for you to see them? Well, under the heading of screening availability, you'll note that every film in the course is available online for streaming, most of them on multiple platforms, and at least 10 of the 17 should be free for you through Fordham. Now, there are also library copy DVDs of all of the films that we're going to be studying, which you will be able to access at some point, I hope, if and when the library opens. Now, when you are screening the films, please be sure to see them before the lectures, which we'll then be talking about and analyzing them, all right? I'll be sending you links to these lectures each Tuesday and Friday. But you can, of course, also view the lectures at your convenience. You don't have to look at them on Tuesday or Friday necessarily. And certainly, as I noted, you certainly don't have to watch them all at one time. Now, one of the few advantages to the online format is suggested is that you can stop and start them and absorb them at whatever rate you wish. The course text. Well, the primary text and the only book that I have ordered for you is Ed Sikoff's excellent Film Studies and Introduction. It's for sale at the University Bookstore. You can also get it online. It's a paperback. Most of the assigned reading from this book comes from early in the term. After the third week, we probably won't be using it much, but it is important, certainly in the beginning. The book is clear, accessible, and extremely helpful, I think you'll find. Now, you'll note also in the syllabus there are other required readings. Those who are registered for the course will find these on Blackboard under the course title and number. These readings include selections from Timothy Corrigan's book on writing about film, which I've assigned in advance for each of your essays. The Blackboard readings also include several seminal essays on film theory, including those that I've already mentioned. Please note on your syllabus that these readings are not assigned by specific calendar dates, but rather are assigned by the topic or the film to which they pertain. You will also find on Blackboard a comprehensive glossary of film terminology that will supplant the one that I sent you as an email attachment, and also the one that is in the back of Sikov's book. You will need to know and understand these terms when you are writing your papers, but also really when you're watching the films. Those papers that I've just mentioned consist of 3 short, that is 2 to 3 page analyses of particular aspects of cinema, and finally a 6 to 7 page critical essay. Now, in order to write those papers well, I suggest that you take notes while you're watching each of the films and then also take notes during the lecture. I will be happy to arrange Zoom conferences to discuss your papers with any of you, to discuss any assignment. And certainly I will also be happy to talk to you about them over email. And remember also, at our Friday optional question-answer sessions from 4 to 4:30, I will devote them entirely to your thoughts, questions, and ideas, which can include questions, if you wish, about the assignments. Okay, so I hope that through those sessions I'll get to know you, if only virtually. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about terminology. In order to watch and analyze a film intelligently, it's important to know the technical language of cinema and to understand how films are made. So I'm going to devote the remainder of today's lecture and the beginning of the next one to an introductory discussion of cinematic technique and the vocabulary that we use in discussing film. This will, I hope, prepare you for the subsequent lectures I'll be giving and for the analytic work that you'll be doing in the course. Now, there are 4 key elements in narrative filmmaking that are really central to every one of the films that we'll watch and discuss, and probably central to every film you've ever seen. First, what we call mise en scène. Second, camera shots, of which there are a wide variety. Third, editing. And fourth, sound. Each of these 4 elements, mise en scène, camera shots, editing, and sound, carries with it its own technical vocabulary, and I'll be introducing that vocabulary momentarily. The remainder of today's lecture is going to concentrate on the first of those 2 elements that I've just mentioned, mise en scène and camera shots. Well, what is mise en scène? It's a term that was first used by the film critics in France in the journal Cahiers du Cinéma in the 1950s. The same critics who would ultimately become the French New Wave directors. And the term mise en scène means literally that which has been put into the scene, that which has been placed before the camera, if you will. Mise en scène then refers to all of the elements that we see in front of the camera, which is to say the film set, the props, costumes, makeup, lighting, and even the gestures and facial expressions of the actors, but not the dialogue, okay? Now, some film scholars, including Ed Sikov in the course text, also regard the camera's angles and movements as part of the mise en scène, but others see the work of the camera as an entirely different and distinct dimension of film. And I share that latter view, and that's why we're going to examine camera shots as a separate category after mise en scène. In most films, the mise en scène of any particular scene or sequence gives the film an aesthetic, distinctive look. But mise en scène has other important purposes besides simply the kind of aesthetic appearance. Mise en scène can create atmosphere, it can advance the story, and it can also offer insight, as we'll see in a few moments, into the characters. A film's mise en scène always evokes a particular world, be it a familiar world or a remote one. And as we register this world through the mise en scène, through what has been placed in front of the camera, we gain a clearer understanding of the events and characters that are occurring. So it's not simply a look. It's an atmosphere and it is a way of advancing our understanding of the narrative and the characters. Now, you'll note that sometimes a film's set design and lighting and costume and the positioning of objects and even the characters' gestures, all those things that form mise-en-scène, sometimes they are meant to suggest a familiar reality and the reassuring feelings generally associated with that which is familiar to us. Consider, for example, the mise-en-scène in Nicholas Ray's 1955 classic Rebel Without a Cause. Here, starring James Dean, here he plays a troubled high school student whose family has just moved to Los Angeles. And shortly before the clip you're about to see, Dean, the new kid at school, has been forced into a knife fight with the local tough guy. And in order to try to prove his manhood, Dean's character has agreed to race cars with him that evening on a cliff top in a deadly game of chicken. Well, as Dean returns to his suburban home from this traumatic encounter at school, he's bleeding from the fight and looking for reassurance, normality, familiarity, and something nurturing, okay? Above all, though, he is looking for some alternative way to confirm his masculinity in post-World War II America, some way that isn't inherently violent and destructive. Have a look at the clip.
Mom? Mom? Hi, Jimbo. You thought I was Mom? Yeah. Well, Carol's out. I was getting Mom some supper. She doesn't feel too well. What'd you do, drop it? Yeah. You dropped it? Yeah. Shh. Listen, no. I'd better clean it up before she sees it. Let her see it. What? Let her see it. What can happen? She's... Oh. Dad. Dad. Stan, don't. I mean, you shouldn't. Don't. What are you...
Now, at first, the domestic mise-en-scène that you see seems to provide that sense of reassurance that Dean's character is seeking. There's a brightly lit kitchen in simple primary colors, including pale green walls. It seems a safe domestic space. When Dean first enters the kitchen, just before the clip begins, he takes a cool wet cloth and wipes his face with it to calm himself. And then at the start of the clip, he opens the refrigerator and drinks cold milk straight out of the bottle. This milk image seems linked to a desire for some sort of maternal comfort or nurturing, because when Dean starts up the stairs, he says, "Mother," thinking he hears her up there. Now, the style of acting here seems as fluid and natural, as realistic and familiar as the setting itself, this suburban setting. But a moment later, the scene shifts to the upper floor of the house, and all of the illusory American normality of the kitchen mise-en-scène that Dean's troubled character seeks is suddenly subverted. When he ascends the stairs, Dean sees not a nurturing mother, but rather his henpecked father in an apron picking up the tray he dropped while waiting on his domineering wife. Instead of an image of manhood that he can respect as a role model and somehow emulate, the young man finds his father, played by Jim Backus, on his knees in abject service and self-imposed humiliation. The apron and the tray, while familiar domestic objects in themselves, are dislocated here and troubling. They're completely out of place in this setting, certainly worn by a man, and certainly in the gendered context of 1950s America. Dean's look of baffled disbelief at first marks his realization that he can never really express himself as a man in middle-class America in any way except through danger and aggression. His expression changes, though, from simple bewilderment, first to bitter laughter, and then to disgust, and finally to speechless outrage as he tries to rip the emasculating apron off his obsequious father. In a single scene, then, Ray uses mise-en-scène to set up the familiar reassuring iconography of American suburban tranquility and normality that the young man desires, only then to destabilize it and puncture the illusion a moment later. Now, in other fiction films, we find directors use mise-en-scène in an opposite way, to create not a sense of the familiar, but rather to create a sense of the radically strange, a distorted reality. In short, a mise-en-scène that is meant to defamiliarize the viewer from the very start by making the set design, the lighting, the costumes, the positioning of objects seem exaggerated or unnatural. Now, this distortion reflects the troubled state very often of the protagonist's mind or the condition of his or her life. Consider, for example, the famous opening of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, a film that was so far ahead of its time that it redefined the cinematic vocabulary when it appeared in 1941. Wells begins the film with shots of Xanadu, a strange, moldering mansion belonging to the newspaper tycoon Charles Foster Kane, based on William Randolph Hearst, who tried and failed to suppress the film. We discover that Kane is now an old man dying behind the facade of the abandoned palace. This gigantic edifice is shrouded in a miasmic mist at the opening, and the opening mise-en-scène suggests both the deranged magnitude of Kane's ambitions and the corruption of his life in pursuing them. The mise-en-scène evokes these ideas then even before Kane appears on screen later in the clip. Have a look. What Wells puts in front of the camera here is as alien and foreboding as the brightly lit kitchen in Ray's film is familiar. The first image is a rusty no trespassing sign hanging on a wire fence to ensure the occupant's isolation. Then we see an abandoned menagerie with a stray monkey suggesting Kane's exotic tastes. And then we see Xanadu's Gothic ornamentation evoking gloom and decay. But here, as in Rebel Without a Cause, there is a counter-suggestion when the mise-en-scène abruptly shifts. When the camera penetrates the lighted window, we see the aged Kane in his final moments of life. He is holding a snow globe, as clean and white as the mansion is haunted and dark. He mutters the word rosebud, and stricken a moment later, drops the snow globe. We see it roll away and break on the floor. Only at the very end of the film do we learn the meaning and origin of Kane's dying word. Rosebud was the name of his sled when he was a boy, which we glimpse in a flashback when we see him as an adolescent playing in the Colorado snow later in the film. The sudden memory of this sled, triggered by the snow globe that Kane is holding, recalls for him a time of carefree innocence that he was never able to recapture. In the film's final frames, we see the sled, Rosebud, consigned to a junk heap, its painted name visible as it goes up in flames. Well, following the opening evocation in the mise-en-scène of corruption and death, Wells' extraordinary film consists of a series of flashbacks on Kane's life, as told from the perspectives of various people who knew him, and who each try to explain how a man of such power and promise ended his life in the isolation and decay revealed at the start. In short, the opening mise-en-scène in Citizen Kane establishes a sense of mystery about Kane, among many other things, and thus it initiates the trajectory of the film's narrative that follows. It's a kind of detective story that attempts to unravel the mystery of this man's life. Two other things to note here about this clip. First, Wells clearly intends for the dark, moribund mansion to mirror the inner life and feelings and circumstances of its owner, the protagonist, Kane. This use of elements in the mise-en-scène to reflect states of mind or feeling in a character is known as expressionism. Now, cinematic expressionism originated in Germany in the 1920s and 30s in silent films like Wien's terrifying Nosferatu, which you may know, and also in early sound films like Fritz Lang's masterpiece M. Both of those films, German expressionists at large, influenced Orson Welles. We'll find expressionistic mise-en-scène in some of the films that we're going to be studying this semester, including Bertolucci's The Conformist and Polanski's Chinatown. But we'll find it, I think, this cinematic expressionism in the mise-en-scène most overwhelmingly in Bergman's extraordinary Cries and Whispers. Also note that, like many filmmakers in the 1940s and 50s, including Ray in Rebel Without a Cause, Wells, in the clip you just saw, used a constructed set for his mise-en-scène with certain foregrounded objects, and behind them a facade and then a projected backdrop. Other filmmakers, however, starting as we'll see with the French New Wave directors, were committed to shooting on location rather than on a sound stage with a constructed mise-en-scène. That is, they wanted to use actual buildings and landscapes to compose the settings that we see. And we'll start when we see that in Truffaut's Jules and Jim. Okay, let's turn now to the second major component of cinema, camera shots. I'm going to divide this part of my commentary into two sections. First, still camera, and then moving camera. Let's start with the angles and positions we find when the camera is still. That is, when it is not moving at all. Okay? The definitions here are worth noting at the outset. First, there is low angle shots. That is a shot taken up from a camera that is positioned much lower than the subject being filmed. Okay, so it is a shot essentially looking up. On the other hand, a high angle shot is a shot taken from a camera that's positioned much higher than the subject being filmed. Thus, it is a shot looking down. A close-up is a shot that uses close focus to isolate a character's face or an object perhaps to make it appear larger. And an extreme close-up, as for example Kane's lips in the clip you just saw, is a more extreme enlargement at closer range that isolates just part of a face, such as a mouth or eyes or some section of an object. A medium shot is a shot in which most of an actor's body can be seen along with a significant portion of the background. On the other hand, a long shot is a shot from a distance that frames a character or object within an enveloping spatial context so we see their entire body and a good deal more. An extreme long shot is one in which the character or object appear at a vast distance against a backdrop of surrounding space, which takes up much more of the frame than the character or object does. And finally, an aerial or bird's eye shot is a still shot taken from an extremely high angle overhead. Not simply a high angle shot, but one which usually is positioned on some kind of artificial structure. Okay, now with those definitions behind us, and those are definitions that are so rudimentary that you'll want to master them almost immediately, I want to illustrate the range of stationary camera angles and distances and how they work together by revisiting that opening of Citizen Kane that you just saw, and now talking about not mise en scène, but the camera shots within it. And for that purpose, you may wish to replay that same scene immediately after I offer this analysis. From the moment the mansion appears, the sequence consists of 12 discrete shots, excuse me, all of them using a still camera, not a moving camera. Number one, we open with several long shots of Xanadu. We see this extravagant edifice at a distance, first from behind the barbed wire, and then with an abandoned lake and golf course in the foreground. This is also what is known as an establishing shot, which is not a shot defined by the camera's position or angle, but rather a type of shot. In this case, a shot that establishes location. We then cut to a medium shot of a lighted window. It's a long take meant to arouse the viewer's voyeuristic interest in the inhabitant inside, especially when the light mysteriously goes out. Number three. Next, we see the same window in, and again, a medium shot, but some hours have passed because now it's illuminated by the dawn outside. 4. Following this, Wells takes us inside the house by using a transition between exterior space and the anticipated movement into the mansion. He does this with what's called a superimposition. I'll talk about that next time. But it is essentially a technique in which one image is filmed over another. In this case, a snowstorm is superimposed on the exterior of Kane's mansion, and we soon discover where that snowstorm originates. 5. Next, we get a close-up of a snow-covered cottage. But then, 6. Kane uses what is called a zoom to move to a long shot of the cottage, revealing that what appeared to be a real structure was actually inside a glass globe. This revelation is thematically crucial. It indicates that things are not what they appear in the film, and that our view of Kane himself will similarly change with perspective and the position of the tellers on their view of him, just as our view of the snow globe cottage changes when we realize that it is simply a kind of ornament. I mentioned that he uses a zoom to move quickly to a long shot of the cottage. And a zoom, although the name implies movement, is actually a still camera technique. A zoom is a shot from a still camera that appears to track forward or away from an object, but this illusion of movement is created because of a change in the lens from a telephoto or wide angle lens. And the effect is the sudden enlargement or shrinkage of the object as if you were moving toward or away from it, but in fact the camera remains stationary. Okay. The seventh shot in this sequence is this. We cut then to an extreme close-up of the dying Kane's lips as they murmur his last words, Rosebud. Then we get the eighth shot. Wells then cuts to a medium shot of Kane's hand dropping the globe. Okay? And then the ninth shot. Without moving, the camera follows the path of the globe as it rolls and shatters just at the moment when Kane's life is also shattering, ending. Then the 10th shot. We get a distorted long shot here of the nurse entering the room as she would appear from Kane's perspective, lying on the floor, looking, as he seems to be here, through a piece of shattered glass that distorts what he sees. It's as if we share with him in this moment what he may have experienced in his last moment of consciousness. Then the 11th shot. As we move to the end of the sequence, we see a medium shot of the nurse in a darkened room laying out Kane's body and placing it in repose. And finally, the 12th shot is this. We return to the opening exterior long shot of the mansion. The lights are out again, as is Kane's life. And we are shut out now, too, having entered briefly. We're still trying to understand the meaning of what we had seen inside, but only for a short period of time. Now, among the many amazing things in this opening sequence is a technique which Orson Welles was a particular master of, and that's called deep focus photography. Welles did not invent it. We find it in Renoir and others before him, but Welles put it perhaps to more extraordinary use than anyone else. Deep focus is a cinematographic technique that uses a wide-angle lens that allows both the objects in the foreground and in the background of a shot to be simultaneously in clear resolution. Now, usually films in the 1930s and 40s showed objects in the foreground in perfect focus, but the background was not. But when Kane, in the clip you've just seen, drops that glass globe through deep focus photography, we see both a close-up of his hand in the foreground and with equal clarity the globe as it is rolling away in the distance. This deep focus produces a heightened sense of visual immediacy, and it can even be used to juxtapose multiple sites of action. For example, in a flashback from Kane's childhood, we see Kane's mother in the foreground inside the house, signing papers brought by a lawyer that will send the boy away to live with a rich benefactor in New York. In the middle ground, behind her, we see Kane's weak-willed father protesting the decision, but soon yielding to his domineering wife. Meanwhile, in the third plane, in the background, but with absolute luminous clarity, out the window, we see the child, Kane, in clear focus through that window, quite unaware of the life-altering event transpiring inside as he plays happily in the snow. Welles uses deep focus photography in this scene to juxtapose these three different planes of simultaneous action and note the irony of the momentous event that is occurring in the child's life, of which he has no idea at all. Have a look at the clip.
Charles.
Kane.
Pull your muffler around your neck, Charles.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes. I'll sign those papers now, Mr. Thatcher.
You people seem to forget that I'm the boy's father.
It's going to be done exactly the way I've told Mr. Thatcher.
There'll be nothing wrong with Colorado. I don't see why we can't raise our own son just because we come into some money. If I want, I can go to court. A father has a right to. A boarder that beats his bill and leaves worthless stock behind. That property is just as much my property as anybody's, now that it's valuable, And if Fred Graves had any idea all this was going to happen, he'd have made out those certificates in both our names.
However, they were made out in Mrs. Kane's name.
He owed the money for the board to the both of
The
us.
bank's decision on all matters
I
concerning...
don't hold with signing my boy away to any bank as
I
guardian
want you to
just
stop
because...
all this nonsense,
The bank's
Jim.
decision on all matters concerning his education, his places of residence, and similar subjects is to be
The
final.
idea of a bank being the guardian.
I want you to stop all this nonsense, Jim.
We will assume full management of the Colorado load, of which I repeat, Mrs. Kane, you are the sole owner.
Where do I sign, Mr. Thatcher?
Right here, Mrs. Kane.
Now, you'll note here that there are two very different cotemporal events occurring at one time: the signing of the papers and the child playing. And the contrast of calculated greed occurring inside and innocent joy outside is deeply and painfully ironic. It's a moment of loss, and Kane will never get back to his joyful origins, origins that he dreams of as he looks at the snow globe in the moment just before his death. Okay, now before turning to camera movements and another nomenclature of shot making, I want to illustrate the angles and positions of the still camera that we've been considering by looking at the opening of another American classic, Billy Wilder's 1950 film Sunset Boulevard. It's a movie narrated, strangely, by a dead screenwriter whose body is discovered at the start of the film floating in the swimming pool of the aging starlet played by Gloria Swanson, who murdered him. Have a look.
Yes, this is Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles, California. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning. That's the homicide squad, complete with detectives and newspapermen. A murder has been reported from one of those great big houses in the 10,000 block. You'll read about it in the late editions, I'm sure. You'll get it over your radio and see it on television. Because an old-time star is involved. One of the biggest. But before you hear it all distorted and blown out of proportion, before those Hollywood columnists get their hands on it, maybe you'd like to hear the facts, the whole truth. If so, you've come to the right party. You see, the body of a young man was found floating in the pool of her mansion, with 2 shots in his back and 1 in his stomach. Nobody important, really. Just a movie writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool. Only the price turned out to be a little high. Let's go back about 6 months and find the day when it all started.
Okay. Here's the sequence of camera angles that you just saw. First, a ground level view of a speeding set of police cars. 2, this is followed by a brief aerial shot as they arrive at a California mansion, another California mansion. And this extreme high angle shot, this aerial shot, is filmed from overhead as if the dead narrator were looking down on the world and from a position outside his mortal body. Third, we then see a long shot of the pool from ground level with a body floating in it, in that long shot. It is also not just a long shot, but it's a high angle long shot because we see not only from a distance, but from an elevated perspective, though not as high as an aerial shot. Fourth, then, strangely and quite unexpectedly, we get an extreme low angle shot looking up from the bottom of the swimming pool, looking up at that same dead body. We now see the face, the narrator's body, we later learn. It's floating face down with the police standing along the poolside in the background, but they are presented as blurred, not in deep focus. Note that this underwater shot looking up at the body is the exact reverse and counterpart of the high angle shot of the body that we got earlier looking down from above at the pool. And these opposing but complementary perspectives on the body suggest the double perspective of the protagonist himself, played by William Holden, who is, for the viewer, strangely in this movie, both dead and alive. He's a character within the film narrative, but he is also a disembodied voice outside it, because we discover that he has been murdered at the beginning of the film, and everything else will be a long flashback. The narrator speaks in the present tense at the start, but after this he narrates the rest of the story in the past tense, looking back from beyond the grave. But as the story he's recalling unfolds, we see him not just as a dead body in a pool, but we see him when he was alive, even though the voice is the voice of a dead man. Okay, let's turn now to the second broad type of shots that I mentioned, those that are made with a moving camera. Bear in mind that the word movies derives from the notion of movement on stage, on screen. Since its inception, films have been called motion pictures as opposed to a series of still photographic images. And the reason for this is that film shots are defined and distinguished not just by the position and distance and angle of the camera, but also by the movement of the camera. And I want to review briefly some of the most common camera movements that you should come to recognize in the films that we're going to be watching this semester, beginning with the two most common camera movements, pans and tilts. In both of these, the camera rotates horizontally or vertically, but does not actually change position. The movement is on a swivel. Again, the definitions are useful to bear in mind. A pan is when the camera pivots on a horizontal axis from side to side, but doesn't change location. And a tilt is when the camera pivots on a vertical axis, up and down, but does not change location. Now, one reason that pans and tilts are so deeply ingrained in cinematic technique is that they mimic the movement of the human eye as we turn our head to look at the world, looking up or down or left or right. And thus, this use of pans and tilts in shot making heightens the viewer's sense of cinematic realism, tends to make us forget that we're watching a projected illusion. Now, one of the most memorable demonstrations of this comes of pans and tilts and the way in which they simulate the human eye movement comes at the start of Hitchcock's inexhaustibly brilliant film Rear Window. It's a movie about voyeurism that begins with a camera positioned in a window, panning and tilting as it surveys other apartment windows in a Greenwich Village courtyard. And this camera, panning and tilting, is going to make, at the beginning of the film, you'll see two slow orbits around. In doing so, it pauses to let us look at the composer across the way, to see a couple sleeping on their balcony, to ogle the dancer who is nicknamed Miss Torso. And we get this voyeuristic perspective on these characters even before the film's protagonist, played by Jimmy Stewart, takes up his own act of roving detection, looking in these same windows. In fact, during the clip you're about to see at the beginning of the film, we see Jimmy Stewart twice in close-up as we return to his window, but in both cases, he is asleep. In short, Hitchcock makes us voyeurs before Jimmy Stewart invites us to join him in his voyeurism. Have a look.
When you wake up in the morning, do you feel tired and run down? Do you have that listless feeling?
As movie technology developed, cameras were increasingly moved themselves during the shooting, mounted on dollies or on cars so that they could follow the action in a scene with their own mobility and not simply pan or tilt. Now, the most common of these mobile camera shots is what is called a tracking shot. Here, the camera, mounted on wheels, usually on a dolly, moves forward or backward, but most often moves laterally to follow a character or character's movement. Okay? Now, you'll note in this respect that you're going to see an abundance of tracking shots when we turn to Truffaut next time. But you'll also see in Truffaut and in most of the films we're going to consider two other important moving camera shots: crane shots and handheld camera. And again, the definitions are important. A crane shot is one in which a camera is mounted on a crane, okay? So it's an aerial shot, but it's not still like a bird's eye view aerial shot. Rather, because it is on a crane and the crane can move high in the air, it can move laterally or it can rise up and down, descending or ascending from ground level, the crane shot. And then the handheld camera shot is one in which, rather than mounting the camera on a tripod or some steady rolling surface or wheels, instead a technician holds the camera and it is, generally speaking, then carried rather than mounted on a dolly or crane or tripod. And this produces a kind of jerky quality, often because film cameras tended to be very heavy. They would devise a lightweight camera so that it could in fact be used and handheld to follow the action. Now, with these definitions in mind, note that the esteemed British director David Lean, in his 1946 filming of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, provides early in the film an excellent compendium of moving camera shots in which the camera both rotates on its axis and moves with the action. In the clip you're about to watch, I don't know if you know the novel or not, but in the clip you're about to watch, the young orphan protagonist in Great Expectations, Pip, is visiting the grave of his parents, who have died some years earlier, when he is accosted by an escaped convict named Magwitch. Have a look.
You little devil, or I'll cut your throat.
No, sir, no.
Tell us your name. Quick.
Pip. Pip, sir. Sir.
Show us where you live. Point out the place.
There, sir. There.
Now, where's your mother?
There, sir. No, sir. There, sir. Also Georgiana. That's my mother.
Ah. And is that your father along with your mother?
Yes, sir, him too. Late of this parish.
Ah. And who do you live with? Supposing you're kindly let to live, which I ain't made up my mind about yet.
With my sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery the blacksmith.
Blacksmith, eh? Now look at here. Do you know what a pile is?
Yes, sir.
Do you know what whittles is?
Yes, sir. Food, sir.
Then you get me a fire and you get me whittles, or I'll have your heart and liver out.
If you'll kindly let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick and perhaps I could attend more.
Now you bring that file and them whittles to me in this churchyard tomorrow morning early.
Yes, sir.
And never dare to say a word if you've seen such a person as me.
No, sir.
If you do, your heart and liver will be tore out and roasted and ate. There's a young man hid with me, and in comparison with him, I'm an angel. That young man has a secret way of getting at a boy and at his liver. Boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. Say heaven strike you dead if you don't.
Heaven strike me dead if I don't.
Now you know what you promised, young man. Get off home.
Good night, sir.
Okay, let's analyze the moving camera shots that we find here in the same way that we analyze the still camera shots in Citizen Kane and in the Billy Wilder film. Number one, we start with a slow tracking shot as the moving camera follows the boy while he runs across the moors. This is a tracking shot, but it is also an extreme long shot. Okay? Number two, the camera then pauses in a medium shot as the boy walks toward the viewer. Number three, now the camera pans, that is, it pivots horizontally as the boy walks to the gravesite. Number four, now as he looks up at the eerie sounds of the trees above him, we get what's called a reaction shot, okay? A reaction shot is a still shot that captures an immediate response as the boy's face now registers fear. This is followed by two low-angle shots looking up from a low angle at the branches, which are anthropomorphized, sort of to resemble a human face, at least from the boy's perspective. Number five, now we get another brief pan as the camera starts to follow the boy running away from the graves when suddenly he runs into a man who has been hidden outside the frame. This positioning ensures that the viewer is as surprised by Magwitch as the boy is. We share this sudden concussive sense of a terrifying collision. Number six, now we get a close-up of Magwitch's menacing face. And then number seven, now he turns Pip upside down to emphasize the boy's vertiginous feeling. Lean gives us a high-angle shot as we look down from above and see the boy's head by Magwitch's feet. Now, number eight, Magwitch bends Pip over the grave and pulls him up again, and we get a slight tilt as the stationary camera pivots slightly down and then pivots slightly up, following the movement of Pip's body as he's bent over the grave and then pulled up again. Next, we get what is called a two-shot, okay? A two-shot is simply a shot, usually in medium distance, of two individuals in the same frame, and a three-shot is three individuals in the same frame. In this two-shot, we see Pip and Magwitch conversing side by side, which curiously, despite the terror Pip experiences here, points to the improbable relationship between them that will endure through the rest of the film and is really the key to Pip's development and fate. And finally, 10. The sequence concludes with a return to the opening long shot, much as the opening, you recall, in Citizen Kane began and ended with the long shot of the house. Here, too, we return now to the same image we began with, but it's not a still camera shot. It's a moving camera shot in which, again, the camera is tracking as we see Pip now running home. Now, again, as with the Citizen Kane clip and Sunset Boulevard clip, it might be helpful, having heard this analysis after seeing the clip, to go back and review it on your own in order to be able to take it apart shot by shot. Okay? It's also a good way of testing your own ability to identify terms and matching terms to particular techniques. All right. Now, all of the moving shots that I mentioned in that sequence were made by a camera that was firmly mounted on a tripod or a moving dolly. Okay? But sometimes directors use a deliberately unsteady handheld camera, as I've mentioned, to create turbulent and jarring effects. And to illustrate this, we're going to examine a very famous sequence that I suspect most of you have seen and shuddered at some point in the past. The shower scene in Hitchcock's Psycho. Here, I also want you to note how the positioning and movement of the camera establishes the character's subjective points of view in an extreme way. Now, the convention of showing a character's perspective in film is usually to show them looking and then to present what they see as it would appear to them. Only what we see from their perspective in conventional film isn't really meant to be seen through their eyes so much as a perspective over their shoulder. That was, for example, what we saw in the first clip when James Dean character sees his father on his hands and knees up there. It's his perspective, but the actual angle, as in most Hollywood films, is over the character's shoulder, okay? But in what we're going to see in Hitchcock, we find something else, okay? What we will get is not an over-the-shoulder view, but rather a presentation of what the eye actually takes in. Now, what I'm getting at is this. In order to heighten realism, some filmmakers employ a technique that is called subjective camera in order to reveal a character's perspective in the most authentic and intense way. Subjective camera is defined this way: a cinematographic technique in which the camera becomes the eye of a character, presenting not a conventional view over the character's shoulder, but rather presenting his or her actual angle and visual field. One example is if you sometimes see subjective camera in which an individual is looking through binoculars or a telescope, and you see the rim of the binoculars or telescope. That's subjective camera. That's what the eye would actually see. That's not an over-the-shoulder view. You're going to see instances of this in the Psycho clip you're about to get. Now, the shots in this clip from Psycho, the individual shots are very brief and very quick, and the scene moves with almost dizzying speed as Hitchcock cuts back and forth to establish three different subjective perspectives here. First, as you'll see, there is the perspective of the killer, Norman Bates, played by Tony Perkins. He's a psychopath who likes to dress up as his dead mother, and then in that cross-dressing form, murder women who sexually arouse him. In an earlier scene, he had spied Janet Leigh, who has made the mistake of stopping at his motel. He spied her through a hole in the wall of the motel that he runs. Now, at first, we'll see Janet Leigh go into the bathroom and flush the toilet with a torn-up letter. And then she will enter the shower. All of this comes from the killer's subjective camera eye point of view, voyeuristically, through a hole in the wall. Then we'll cut back to his point of view again during the murder. But in this sequence, you're also going to see Hitchcock gives us the victim, Janet Leigh's subjective camera eye point of view at times, both when she looks up at the shower head and sees the water coming down, but also in brief flashes as she sees the killer in drag during the murder. But finally, and intriguingly, we get a third unspecified point of view in this sequence, the perspective through the shower curtain when we see Tony Perkins enter the bathroom and depart. But the victim doesn't see this. And we also get this third perspective when Janet Leigh slumps to the floor and we watch her blood flow down the drain. Have a look and shudder. Okay. Well, Hitchcock's quick succession of shots throughout the sequence establishes these shifting points of view that I've mentioned. The killer's and the victim's perspectives, in particular, are intercut in a rapid series of very, very brief shots. Now, as was Hitchcock's practice, he sketched each one of those shots out on paper before filming them. In fact, you can see the succession of images that you've just watched on screen drawn out, sketched out, one by one on the cover of the Sikov text that we're using. Panels that Hitchcock, who started as a draftsman, used, sketching out each shot, each frame ahead of time before he ever began filming. Now, one could analyze Hitchcock's camera movements and effects in this famous scene at great length, and critics have. But for our purposes, I want you to note three things about it. Number one, during the murder, Hitchcock shifts to a handheld camera. That is, a camera mounted not on a stable tripod, but rather held in an unsteady hand. Now, this is notable because we did get a stable camera when Janet Leigh walked from her bedroom into the bathroom, okay? But once she enters the shower, the handheld camera begins, and it creates a jerkiness and instability that is perfectly suited to the physical and emotional violence of the scene. It makes us feel as if we are somehow part of this jarring, terrible, turbulent scene. This instability adds then, this handheld camera, this unsteadiness to our visceral horror, makes it seem more real, invests us more deeply in it. And particularly so as we see from handheld camera reaction shots of the victim's face as she is being attacked. Okay. Second thing to bear in mind about this sequence is that the intermittent representation of the killer's point of view before and during the murder comes, as I've noted, from subjective camera. It converts the camera lens into the eye of the character. Instead of presenting what the killer sees in some modified form over the shoulder or something approximating it, what we get is a simulation of his actual field of perception, presenting the murder directly through the killer's eyes, and doing it so completely that we not only see his terrified naked victim, but we also see from his point of view his own hand and knife as he strikes her in the same visual field as we would ourselves if we were holding a knife. Now, one reason the scene is so harrowing then is that we are made to register the victim's subjective point of view as she sees the knife coming, and also the killer's point of view as we see the knife from his visual perspective. It makes it seem more authentic and in some way more inescapably horrible. Note, too, that we get the victim's point of view first when she gazes up at the shower head from a low angle, and we see the water coming down just as she would through her own eyes. And then we get her subjective point of view, subjective camera eye again, at the end when she looks up at the curtain rod in her last moments of consciousness as she pulls it down when she collapses. Okay, the third thing I want to note in this sequence is that after the stabbing, the frenzied pace of the shots and camera movements slows down, and the shots lengthen. They're not edited so that they're just a couple of seconds long. The pace slows down just as the action slows down. And we get an extended tracking shot of the dead woman's blood going down the bathroom drain. But then the camera stops its lateral tracking movement and it rotates around the drain, okay? Here, rotating and panning around the drain, drawing the viewer into that drain along with the swirling blood. This vertiginous panning is followed then by an extreme close-up of the victim's open eye, which is shaped round like the drain. The open eye also, of course, recalls the voyeuristic eye of the killer, reminding us that the murder began really with a penetrating act of visual violence, his seeing her through the wall. Well, it's also notable that this image of the drain echoes the circular trope we've seen throughout the sequence. The blood circling down the drain vortex is a bookend for that image of the flushing toilet bowl vortex that we got at the beginning of the scene. So that using those as frames, we sense there's a kind of fatality, an inevitability built into that parallelism at the beginning and the end. The victim herself has become now, like that paper she was flushing, a disposable, flushable object as her blood goes down the drain. Finally, looking ahead to the topic of editing, which I'll talk about next time, I want you to note an editing trick that Hitchcock employs here. It's called graphic matching. That is, using objects of similar shapes to create transitional links between shots. Specifically, he cuts from the circular drain with the rotating blood and water to the victim's round eye as the camera rotates around it. We move from one seamlessly to the other, and it seems smoother and less abrupt precisely because of the similar shape of the eye in the drain. Now, I'll explain why filmmakers use graphic matching next time. But before we consider editing next time, to conclude today, I want to describe one final aspect of shot making, and that is the sequence shot. Your glossary also defines the sequence shot as a so-called long take. It's a shot in which a moving camera covers an entire series of events in one extended moving shot without any editing cut at all. Here, rather than using discrete shots to build a scene by editing them together, instead we find a single long continual extended shot constitutes a scene in itself by covering two or more sequential events. Now, Renoir and Orson Welles were two of the great practitioners of the sequence shot, and as we'll see, Truffaut is a master of it as well. But consider, as an illustration of the sequence shot, yet another brief but wonderful example from Citizen Kane, inexhaustible as it is. In this scene you're about to see, Kane's second wife, who is a talentless woman with dreams of becoming an opera singer, is, through his influence, given an opportunity to appear at the Met. He has coerced the directors of the Met to allow her on stage, even though she is completely unsuited for it. Note in this scene on stage, as Welles' camera tilts upward, we move seamlessly, without an editing cut at all, from the scene of this terrified woman on stage, up through the rafters, through all of the equipment, to two workmen who are sitting high up above, expressing the collective judgment of everyone else as one of them holds his nose. Have a look. Well, one of the advantages of a shot sequence like this is that it eliminates the need to establish transitions between takes because it follows a series of actions or shows cause and effect without having to stitch together individual scenes by editing them together. Welles manages to create a sense of cause and effect, moving from the scene on stage to the scene up above, without turning the camera off at all. The scene goes on. The sequence goes on in a single scene, single sequence, long take for a full minute. To give you an idea of how rare that is, it's much longer than takes in most movies made today, especially action movies where the average shot lasts less than 5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to conclude today with another sequence shot. In this case, one that is achieved not by the tilt of a camera moving on its axis, as in the Citizen Kane clip, but rather through a camera that tracks through space with its characters on a tripod. It's a scene from Stanley Kubrick's harrowing and ironically titled 1957 film Paths of Glory, set in the trenches during World War I. In this clip, you will see a sadistic French commander meeting with soldiers who are about to be forced to attack the enemy in what amounts to a suicide mission. Have a look.
Soldier, ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
What's your name, soldier?
Sir, Private for Company A.
Uh-huh. You married, Private?
No, sir.
Well, I'll bet your mother's proud of you.
Yes, sir.
Well, carry on, Private, and good luck to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Morning, General. Good morning. Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
Ha! Working over your rifle, I see. Well, that's the way. It's a soldier's best friend. You be good to it, and it'll always be good to you.
Yes, sir.
Well, good luck to you, soldier. Carry on.
Thank you, sir.
soldier? Ready to kill more Germans? That is, everything all right, soldier?
All right. Yes, sir, I'm all right.
Good fella. Are you married, soldier?
Married? Me married?
Yes, have you got a wife?
A wife? Have I got a
Sir?
wife?
He's a bit shell-shocked. I beg your pardon, Sergeant. There is no such thing as shell-shock. Have you got a wife, soldier?
My wife? My wife? Yes, I have a wife. I'm never going to see her again. I'm going to be killed.
Get a grip on yourself. You're acting like a coward.
I am a coward.
Snap out of it, soldier. Sergeant, I want you to arrange for the immediate transfer of this baby out of my regiment. I won't have other brave men contaminated by him.
Yes, sir.
Carry on, Sergeant.
Before the cut that establishes a shot-reverse shot conversation with the last soldier, before that cut, Kubrick's camera tracks through the trench in an unbroken long take that incorporates scenes of his exchanges with two other infantry men as explosions are erupting all around them. Essentially, the sequence incorporates three different scenes, three different soldiers in conversation with this commander. The effect of the long take here is to suggest, I think, the commander's headlong, unstoppable determination to sacrifice the lives of these men for his own self-glorification. Just as the camera doesn't stop, so too, following him, he doesn't stop. He's relentless. For him, the soldiers he converses with are interchangeable parts, not individuals. And his repetition of that same tired tagline, "Are you ready to kill more Germans?" reinforces this commander's dehumanizing approach to war and to his men. Now, we'll see some extraordinary sequence shots, as I mentioned, in the first film in the course, Truffaut's Jules and Jim, next time, which also partly is set during World War I. I hope you enjoy that great film, and I'll be looking forward to talking to you next Friday, I hope, about it, if you wish to join the conversation. Next time, when I begin talking about Jules and Jim, I will start, however, by considering the last two building blocks of filmmaking, which are editing and sound. Bye.